Let's pick up with chapter 1 and verse 12 through chapter 2 and verse 11. Follow along as I read, will you? I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and to explore the wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I realized this also is a striving after the wind. Because in much wisdom there's much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself, and behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold, the treasures of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers, and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who had preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me, and all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Now, I've chosen to entitle this particular section, The Advantages of Worldly Living. The Advantages of Worldly Living. At least that seems to be what Solomon is trying to suggest to us. This is where he began to explore life. So chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 has really given us sort of a background perspective of the pessimistic attitude that Solomon was taking to life, this monotonous routine that life seems to have under the sun. And then he says, there's got to be more than life. He says, when I woke up in the morning, I saw the sun rise. I remembered it had risen 1,000 times before. And I saw the wind blow, and it had blown there before. And I saw men seeking wisdom, and they seemed to never be satisfied with the wisdom that they had. And it was just all monotonous. And so he says, I had to do something about this. He says it was meaningless. In reality, his whole life had lost perspective. So he begins, he says in verses 12 through 14 of chapter 1, and then 16 and 17 as well, he begins to explore these things. And here in verses 13 and 14, he takes a look at what men do, what they produce. And Solomon says he devoted himself to the exploration of all the things that have been done. Third person plural nephel, reflexive. That is, they are doing themselves by men. And his first course of study are the things that men do. So his first course of study here in verse 13, I set my mind to seek and to explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It's a sociological investigation. He says, I'm going to take a look at what men do. Is there anything in this? Maybe there is something to it. After all, men spend the majority of their lives doing and trying to accomplish these tasks. And he says he searched, and he did it in a twofold way. He said he began to seek That is to search out. He sought with integrity, he carefully studied. And it's a word that's used of a very careful student. He says, I became a sociological student of what men do. I became an anthropologist. And I wanted to explore, what is it that men do? And then he uses the word explore, which is a different word, and it's a word that really means to spy out, almost like an investigator or explorer. It's the same word that's used of the 12 spies who went into Canaan in Numbers 13. Solomon was a careful detective in his search. He says, not only did I seek or sought out like a student, but he says, I went exploring. I went exploring. And I was like a detective on a search for clues. To search out, what is it that men do? What do they do? You can see that. He says, I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. So I went on this twofold search. And in verse 14, he tells us a little bit of the significance of it. Solomon gives you his preliminary conclusions about his search. And he says he explored everything that was necessary to know about this area of man's life and what he produces. And he concludes that all of man's efforts and deeds are like a chasing after the wind. It's like chasing after the wind. It's like a dog chasing after its tail. It's something you can't grasp hold of. It's something you can't catch. It's like a dog chasing a garbage truck. Even if he did catch it, what's he going to do with it? All right? But in this particular case, he's never going to catch it. Not in a million years. He'll never catch it. Because he's chasing after the wind. Seems like all of man's activities seem to be a chasing after the wind. So, one research psychologist, William Moulton Marston, asked 3,000 people, what have you to live for? That's a great question to ask. What have you to live for? Whoops. I think the sound effects of my computer is working overtime here. Well, he was shocked to find out that 94% were simply enduring the present while they waited for the future. They waited for something to happen. They waited for their children to grow up and to leave home. They waited for the next year. They waited for another time to take a long dreamed about trip. They waited for tomorrow without realizing that all anyone has is today. It seems like everybody was waiting for something. What are you doing? What is it that you're living for? It's always something that they're waiting for. That's the way Solomon found men. They're never satisfied. So that's the products of men. What about the philosophies of men? Maybe he could find something by exploring them. In verses 16 and 17. Verse 17 says that Solomon turned his quest towards inward contemplation. Maybe somehow he could find significance within himself. And verse 16 says, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, and I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. So you can see his quest. That's really what he's after. And he applies himself to understand wisdom, madness, and folly. The Western mind is prone towards the practical. That is what men do. But the Eastern mind is given more to philosophy and inward meditation. Solomon, he searches out both. He searches out what men do, what they produce. He searches out how men think. What are their philosophies in life? What is this search for human wisdom? What is this search that's made through madness and folly? What is this? And really we get these three things that are listed here. There's wisdom, chokhmah. There's madness, and there is folly. Wisdom is really knowing how to live morally right. Morally right. A truly wise man lived a life of order and virtue. Now you understand that in this early part of Ecclesiastes, that this wisdom is a human wisdom that he's after. This is not godly wisdom. So it's a human wisdom of order and virtue. That was very common in Eastern thought.
Question.
Yes.
What geographic area are you considering when you talk about Eastern thought? You're starting with the Middle East?
Yeah.
And West would begin with Greece?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Oh, it finally showed up. Good. Here, madness, the root idea is to be full of oneself, and hence mad. That's what a mad person is, ultimately. It's a person that's full of themselves. That's a mad person. So, in this sense, Solomon's desire was to search out a life of people who were mad, boastful, self-absorbed people. The Muhammad Alis of this world who said, I'm the greatest. There's no one greater than me. The Nebuchadnezzars of this world that said the same. I am the greatest man to have ever walked this earth. I am God. Madness. And then folly, which is lacking knowledge and discernment. A foolish person, both in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, was a person who lived above the law. They lived above the law. So there was a disregard for common laws and rules, especially moral ones. Almost like Sigmund Freud, who would have man disregard moral law. Especially religious law, because it hindered the expression of the id, the basic expressions of life, of what man was. So to live a life of folly was to live above the law. These are people who live really unto themselves. Maybe they're not as full of themselves as a mad person is, even though madness and folly can be used interchangeably, sometimes as synonymous terms. They're not always identical terms. Then we talk about the search that he made. Verse 17, he says, I set my mind. This time it's not to spy out something, but he sets his mind to know something. The goal is not so much to explore as it is to know. And to know is more than just merely to intellectually comprehend, but the Hebrew word here carries the idea of to completely experience. So I set my mind to completely experience human wisdom, Solomon says, and madness, that completely experience being self-absorbed, and to completely experience living above the law. So I give you a hint, living above the law is foolishness. That's exactly what he did. Remember when we went back to Deuteronomy 17 and what God had instructed the kings of Israel not to do, Solomon broke every one of them, right? He lived above the law. He lived a foolish lifestyle. He indicts himself here. So Solomon lived for a while as a wise man without God, as a madman full of himself, as a man of folly without regard for any moral code or regard for God or others. That's the way he lived. That was his search. He lived as a wise man without regard for God, as a madman full of himself, as a man of folly without regard for any moral code or regard for God or others. He just lived for himself. That was his search. So he's giving us an overall view of what he's done, and he's going to get more specific as he goes on how this unfolded. But now he's kind of giving us the overall view. What's all the significance of this setting his mind to know, personally experience? What conclusion did he come to now that he had switched from being the doer of the word or seeking and exploring what men do to personally experiencing different philosophies of life? Well, he learned what many atheistic philosophers learned late in life, that life has no meaning. Life has no meaning. Seeking the significance of life philosophically is like chasing after the wind. It's trying to grab smoke. You can't do it. You can't find real meaning and purpose in life by personally experiencing human wisdom, human madness, human folly. There is none. There is no meaning there. You can't do it. In other words, there is no significance. It looks like there's something there, but when you really grab a hold of it, you don't have anything. Now, what about the experience of some of these pleasures? Chapter 2, verse 1, and then verse 3, he talks about the experiences of immediate gratification. This is the madness and the folly side. He says, when I went to pursue these things, let me explain to you what happened on the madness and folly side. He says, I experimented with laughter that's brought on by wine. Wine does that, you know. It brings on laughter. In a sense, wine loosens a person up. They shed all their inhibitions. That's the reason why people in the world, guys and girls, meet each other in bars. It's because it's the booze that helped them to shed their inhibitions so that they're not afraid anymore. So they're going to be more courageous, and they'll walk up to somebody and say hi and strike up a conversation. Normally they'd never be able to do that. So, and it's easy to laugh. It's easy to have a good time. Seems like all your problems during the time you're intoxicated go away. And Solomon says, I watch people like that, and they seem to enjoy life, so I thought I'd try that out. So he tried stimulating his body with alcohol because it brought laughter. Remember, he's not seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake here. He's seeking pleasure to see if it brings some kind of meaning to life. That's what he's trying to do. Does this pleasure bring any kind of meaning to life? Does it bring any significance to life if I live for pleasure? Wine lightens the heart. It loosens you up. It brings laughter. The people who drink somehow have more meaning in life. Maybe by getting rid of all your miseries and troubles through intoxication, you can have meaning in life. That's what Solomon wanted to do. Alcohol is a depressant like barbiturates. That's linked to inhibiting a neurotransmitter in the brain called GABA. And when alcohol is consumed, it decreases the GABA receptor sites in the neurons, making more GABA available in the body and a feeling of relief from tension. And so, usually people who drink feel a relief from stress, from tension. They feel good for a little while. We would say today they've tied on a buzz. All right? Got a little buzz. And so they feel a little bit relieved from it. Solomon says, you know what? I tried wine. Now this wine is not the same as grape juice. All right? This is wine with alcohol. And he says, in essence, I tried it in order to experience pleasure and laughter. Eventually, however, with this wine, your body becomes accustomed to and even craves more alcohol in order to restore those pleasant experiences. So slowly but surely, alcohol has decreasing returns for you, and your body adjusts to it and begins to compensate, and so it requires a little bit more later on in order to get the same kind of buzz, and a little bit more after that, and then you go through an adjustment period. And people who have been drinking for a long, long time will make the statement to you, I can hold a lot of alcohol. What they mean by that is that their body is adjusted to it before they get out of their mind drunk. And they can consume a lot, still get the buzz and that relief from tension. But their blood alcohol level could be at a point where, well, just the other day we saw in the newspaper, I think it just occurred yesterday, where a man with twice the legal limit blood alcohol went through a stop sign, drove right through, hit a mother with 3 children, and killed all 4 of them. I heard the extended story of that, on how he drove 2 or 3 blocks after that, and grabbed his registration, got out of his truck, ran from it, called his wife, and had his wife call the police and say that his truck had been stolen. But they got him, and they were able to prove that he was the one who had done it. So alcohol does those kind of things. And not only did he experiment with that, but he also experimented with laughter brought on by folly.
Alcohol, the term withdrawal, is that a term that is used within biblical counseling when somebody's trying to get off of alcohol? Can we still call it withdrawal?
Yeah, I think so. Physically, I think you can do that. You can call it withdrawal, because your body has so adjusted to it. There are definite organic effects from it that your body is adjusted to, and it takes a little while to compensate for not having it. Your blood, your body is used to having a high sugar content, and usually that's what I'll do. I'm working with someone who is struggling with alcohol, and we start to wean them off of it, stop them from drinking. I'll have them drink a lot of sugar pop, because their blood is used to taking that malt, or their body is used to taking that malt, converting it into glucose and putting it into their blood stream. And so you've got all that glucose going in the bloodstream, which is part of that high. All right? So we take away the alcohol. As you wean them off of that, then you replace it with, for a temporary amount of time, some colas that have caffeine and sugar in it. All right? And that slowly helps them to come down from that. You stair-step them down.
I was talking to a nurse recently who told me that alcohol is the only thing that, when somebody withdraws from it, they can physically, shut it down. Is that true? Do you know anything about that?
It's severe forms they can. Yeah. And that's the reason why some hospitals have these detox tanks they put people in. My grandfather's very much like that. He was put in a detox tank on 3 different occasions in a straitjacket, and monitored by hospital personnel and drinking. So, So there's laughter brought on by folly. The context here reveals that Solomon did more than live by some philosophical system of absurdity. It was for the express purpose of seeking pleasure. For a time, he didn't know how to do good. He was skillful at evil. The way Jeremiah 4:22 says, he didn't know how to do good. He's living on the basis of folly. Alexander Pope commented, amusement is the happiness of those who cannot think. Amusement is the happiness of those who cannot think. That's what Solomon, for a time, Solomon threw out the rule book. He lived above the law. He lived for laughter that was brought on by folly. And he didn't do good because he didn't have any moral law. He considered himself above the law. He was skillful at doing evil. But not only that, he also experienced, all of that had to do with immediate gratification. He also went after delayed gratification. In verses 4 through 9 of chapter 2. And verse 4, the gratification of building houses, vineyards, parks and gardens, verses 5 and 6. Servants, verse 7. Flocks and herds, owning them. Amassing gold and silver, verse 8. Making music. The gratification of many wives. The gratification of securing prestige and fame, being well known for his wisdom, and people coming from literally all over the world to see him. All of those things have one thing in common, and that is he didn't just seek things that were of immediate gratification. He also went about his personal experience of madness and folly. He went about for seeking delayed gratification. It took a while to build houses. You don't plant a vineyard and have it produce overnight. It takes a while to do that. Parks and gardens the same way. Having servants and getting the right ones and purchasing them and having them born into your family. Grow up so they can serve you. That takes a while. Owning flocks and herds, gold and silver. This didn't come overnight. So he says, in my search, I exercise discipline. And so that's a pretty hefty search. He says, I amassed all of this stuff to myself. Houses and vineyards and parks and gardens and servants and flocks and herds and gold and silver and music and wives and prestige and fame. He says, I gathered this all in. All of that was the experience of delayed gratification. And then verse 10, total gratification. Here Solomon did things that most men only dream about. He had power, prestige, and position to get anything he wanted. He made it. He found pleasure through immediate and delayed gratification. Did it meet his expectations for life? Did it somehow fill his life with significance and purpose and meaning? Did all of a sudden he walk away from all of this and say, man, look what I have done. I am finally fulfilled. Now I know what life is about. No, in fact, he found it rather exasperating. He found it rather exasperating. It's like the rich man who bought all this stuff, all of his toys and boats and cars and all this stuff, and he found out instead of him owning those things ended up owning him. Once you have all those cars and all those boats and all those houses, you got to care for them, right? You got to dust them and paint them. You got to fix the holes in them. They start to fall apart. You have to repair them. You don't own them. They own you. They fall apart. So what good is all of this? No wonder Solomon says, it's like chasing after the wind. So what are these projects without God? Chapter 2, verse 14, we skipped over that verse. They're meaningless, he says. Chapter 1, verse 15, they're hopeless. Chapter 1, verse 15, they're impossible. Verse 18 of chapter 1, they're grievous. We're just kind of adding up what he said. These are some of his preliminary conclusions. What about the pleasures without God? Those were all the products. Those are what men did. What about these pleasures? They're meaningless. Verse 11 of chapter 2. Verse 2 of chapter 2, foolish. Same verse, unproductive. Chapter 2, verse 11, unprofitable. He says, I tried these things that were wrapped up with immediate gratification, and those things were wrapped up in long-term delayed gratification. And he found these are some of the descriptive things. In both cases, they're meaningless. One, they're hopeless. The other's foolish. One, impossible. The other one, unproductive. One, grievous. The other one, unprofitable. So you're getting this idea. He's chasing smoke. When he tries to wrap his life around the things of this earth, he's wrapping his life around smoke. He's chasing wind. See, he says, that's what life is about. All right. Let's see if we can pick up here a short section here on 12 through 16. Follow along as I read chapter 12 through 16. So I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly, for what will a man do who will come after the king except for what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly and light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity, for there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming of the days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So he says, I hated life. Let's stop at 16. Here's the advantages of worldly lifestyle. What are those advantages? Now he begins to get realistic. He examines them. He says, I tried living by human wisdom. Solomon is speaking of pure human wisdom here, something we call cleverness or extraordinary common sense on a human perspective or level. It is wisdom from an under-the-sun perspective, secular wisdom from the standpoint of practical atheism. Solomon tried living with practical prudence and human shrewdness. He says, this is what I went after. The Bible talks a lot about this human-based wisdom in Exodus 28:3 and 31:3 and 6 and Isaiah 10:13 and Deuteronomy 34:9 and Psalm 90 and verse 12. This is human wisdom without any reference to God. By God's common grace, he has instilled within everyone, Christian, non-Christian alike, a certain level of practicalness, of wisdom, of cleverness to be able to live life. Solomon says, that's what I tried to do. I live life on the basis of that practical, clever wisdom that all men possess. To see... is there anything to this kind of thing? Men today believe more than ever that they can function well without any serious consideration of God. Godless rationalism and pragmatism are alive and well in the church today. Trial and error determines truth, and when reason and experience conflict with the truth of God's word, then reason and experience wins. You see that all the time. Imagine there's three boxes. One box represents experience. Another box represents reason. The other box represents the Word of God. And they're all, by many Christian standards, or Christians have the standard, they're all three on equal plane and equal authority. And when reason and experience conflict with the Word of God, when box 1 and 2 conflicts with box 3, then it's reason and experience that wins out. Solomon says, I lived my life on the basis of human wisdom. Just human cleverness and shrewdness. So when it came to making decisions in life, reason and experience pointed one direction, but God pointed a different direction. And the question is, which way do I want to go? Am I going to follow God's thoughts and God's truth and God's ways and God's faithfulness? Is that what I'm going to do? Or am I going to follow reason and experience, which is man's thinkings, man's conclusions, man's ways, man's feelings? What am I going to do? That's our decision as well. Solomon's choice, he says, was that he followed man's thinkings, man's conclusions, man's ways, man's feelings. And in doing so, this was part of what got him into trouble. It's part of what got him into trouble. Then he tried living by man's madness, he says. The opposite of the lifestyle continuum of human wisdom is human madness. Imagine if life could be put on a continuum, and over here on your right, my left, is wisdom, and over at the opposite end of the continuum is madness. So he went from one extreme to the other. And instead of rationality, Solomon permitted irrationality to rule his life for a time. He discarded practical wisdom and lived completely on the basis of emotion. He became full of himself and madness. Someone like this believes that life doesn't really have to make sense. Almost like the existentialist, he lives for the experience. He lives for whatever brings him the most pleasure and the most hedonistic twinges for that moment. That's the way Solomon lived. He said, I lived in this area of human madness, being full of myself and being self-absorbed. That's the way I lived. Madness is the same term that's used of David when he pretended to be insane there in 1 Samuel 21:13. Same Hebrew term. It says he stammered outside the city, making marks on the gates as saliva foamed around his mouth and his beard. So the root idea is a person who's full of themselves. So there are several references in the Old Testament where God says he would judge the ungodly and it would drive them to madness. It would drive them to themselves, and they find out that all they have with themselves is nothing. It would drive them where all they had was just themselves, and that was ultimately nothing. So this person who has given themselves over to cynical self-indulgence in the pursuit of personal happiness to the utmost. Often madness and drunkenness are associated together. Both types of people act as if they don't have a brain. So when you throw caution to the wind and live as if there's not going to be any tomorrow, then it becomes a lifestyle of madness. There is no tomorrow. And Solomon says, on the one hand, I was over here living a lifestyle of pure human wisdom. And he said, then I pursued the personal experience of trying out this madness, completely being full of myself, almost like a drunken person. Throw caution to the wind, just live from one personal experience to the other. That's the continuum in which I lived. And then thirdly, he tried out man's folly. Madness and folly are very close concepts and are even used interchangeably as synonyms in the New Testament or the Old Testament. However, there's a delicate difference between them, not hynenes, as Longman talks about, but the Hebrew makes a linguistic distinction in the passage, literally madness and folly. Folly is this third type of life that Solomon gave himself to. And remember how we made the distinction where madness is full of himself, folly really has to do with throwing out the rule book. Solomon lived above the law. Madness then stresses irrationality, living by whatever impulse seems to be controlling you at the time. You may be smart, but you don't live by what you know, only by what you feel is right at that particular time. That's how you live. Whatever you think is right or feel is right at that time. Folly, on the other hand, stresses stupidity, a lack of moral obedience. This type of person will live as if there are no ethical standards for life, or at least that those ethical standards don't make any difference at all. They don't make any difference. They live above the law. And Solomon says, listen, in essence, as an autobiographical polemic, he's saying, listen, this is what I did in my life, and he's persuading his people, don't follow my example. And he's going to do that through the argumentation of driving them to the ends of this type of living. See? What's the ends of this kind of living? Where do we go from here? What's the ends? We can see this in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 25 and 26. He says, I directed my mind to know, to investigate, and to seek wisdom and an explanation, and to know the evil, folly, and foolishness of madness. And he immediately connects that with sexual sin. He says, I discovered more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is pleasing to God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her. He says, I indulge myself in everything, especially sexually. So Solomon wants you to know that he has tried everything a man who has the power and the prestige of a king could do, he says. What more could have been done? I've taken my life to the extreme. Is there any form of existence left to experience or to test? No, he's gone from one end of the continuum to the other end of the continuum. All on a human basis. What are the advantages of worldly wisdom over worldly folly? Well, some worldly lifestyles are better than others. Common sense tells you that. In fact, common sense tells you it's better to be sober than to be drunk. It's better to be educated than to be illiterate. It's better to be healthy than sickly. It's better to be dedicated than half-hearted. It's better to be neat and orderly than to be messy and sloppy. Common sense tells you that. He says, listen, when I step back and look at this, from one continuum, worldly wisdom, to worldly madness and folly, the other end of the continuum, as I step back and look at it, one thing I did learn, and that is that worldly wisdom and living that way is better than worldly madness and folly. He says that's one thing I learned. It's better to be wise than to be mad and foolish from a human perspective. So he says, and I saw that wisdom, verse 13 of chapter 2, excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. He says, I realize that worldly wisdom, it's at least better to do that, to be a wise person, than to be a dumb person. A mad, self-absorbed, foolish person. Human wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness, verse 13. So man without God has a degree of common sense. There is a greater benefit, even for ungodly people, to live wisely than foolishly. Stupidity is dangerous, like stumbling around in the darkness. He says, hey, I lived from one extreme to the other, and I'll tell you one thing I learned, that wisdom is a whole lot better than madness and folly. I did learn something from this. So if you're going to live under the sun, then live wisely. Just as sight is better than blindness. Verse 14a, lacking common sense is like blindness. You naively stumble through life. A rational man is preferred above irrational because he possesses discernment. He's got some kind of discernment. So it's like blindness. Madness and folly is like stumbling around, just going from one thing to another. Whatever just kind of piques your interest, and yet there's a lot of bruises and hurts, and it's like the person who it's talked about in Proverbs, the drunkard who stammers around and says, somebody hit me, but I don't know who. He says, it's better to live wise. than with this madness and folly. So there's a big disadvantage to all worldly lifestyles. No matter what lifestyle you adopt, they all have one major flaw. That is, at the end of verse 14, man's mortality. Yet, he says, and yet I know that one fate befalls them both. He says, even though it's better to live by human worldly wisdom than worldly madness and folly, one fate befalls them both. Key idea is that man's life is fleeting and all will die, wise and fool alike. And the realization that only death awaits often sobers the most adamant atheist. Man is faced with the finiteness of his life. His finitude changes it all. Socrates said men apprehend death to be the greatest evil. Bacon says men fear death as children fear to go in the dark. Samuel Johnson told of the horror of his friend's death at the sight of the last conflict. I felt a sensation never known to be before, a confusion of passions, an awful stillness of sorrow, a gloomy terror without a name. He says, I realize that whatever way you live, everybody ends up the same place. Death is a great equalizer. The wise man and the fool share the same fate. There's no difference between the bones of a PhD and an illiterate. Psalm 49, verses 10 through 14, says that. Ecclesiastes 3:19 reinforces that. Even if human wisdom gives you a better life, all of its benefits are short-lived because death is going to cut it short. So it's all the same. He says, even if you choose to be humanly wise, and you're the most clever, shrewd person to ever walk this earth on the basis of human wisdom, and the final analysis doesn't make any difference because the bones of a wise man and the bones of a fool are the same. You can't tell the difference between the two. The famed philosopher Diogenes looked intently at the large collection of human bones piled on one another. Alexander the Great stood nearby and became curious about what Diogenes was doing, and when asked the old man, the reply was, I'm searching for the bones of your father, but I cannot seem to distinguish them from those of the slaves. Alexander got the point. All are equal in death. All are equal in death. That's exactly what Solomon is saying here. Everybody's equal in death. There's no such thing as a lasting human achievements. Nothing man does will last. It's all temporary. It's all passing away. Even if you join all of man's philanthropic organizations. Even science tells you through physics, the second law of thermodynamics, that the earth is dying, changing from a state of complexity to a state of simplicity. Eventually, nothing will be left. Scientists can even calculate when the sun's going to eventually die. The solar system is bent towards extinction. If the Lord tarries, nothing's going to be left. So what's the point? In other words, the advantages of worldly lifestyle, Solomon says, are exaggerated. Your fate is the same as a fool. Your achievements will be forgotten. Your life is headed for extinction. That's not a pretty picture, right? It has become fashionable in our culture to hold the view that death is perfectly natural occurrence. It's part of the rhythm of life. It's not true. It's the unnatural. It's an evidence of the curse. They even try to inculcate our children with that. What is it? The cycle of life? That song in the Lion King movie? As if death is just a natural process of life. It's not a natural process. It's only looking at things under the sun. Death is part of the curse. It's an evidence of the fact that things are not right and things are not natural, that we live in a sin-cursed world. So your fate's the same as a fool. Your achievements are going to be forgotten. Your life is headed for extinction. That's the point. Ultimately, you are not made to exist without God. Your meaning for life cannot come from earthly reality, but from eternal reality. Your life is more than the sum total of your achievements. Your life was intended to be remembered. That's what we're after. That's really what Solomon ultimately is going to be after. Psalm 112 and verse 6. For he will never be shaken. The righteous will be remembered forever. The righteous man. And yet Solomon says there in Ecclesiastes, he says, for there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die, so I hated life, he says. And in saying that, we'll have to pick up there in our next class period. I hated life. I hated life. I hated life. So bubbles, it's all so bubbles. Vanity of vanity, it's all vanity. That's the point. When we're not made to exist without God, your meaning for life cannot come from earthly reality, but from eternal. Your life is more than sum total of achievements. Your life is intended to be remembered.